So good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our latest webinar, How to Build a Net Zero Carbon Plan and Reduce Your Workplace Costs. I'm just going to ask my colleague to put up the presentation, and what we'll do is over the next sort of 20 to 25 minutes, we'll take you through some ideas and structure to create your net zero carbon plan and reduce your workplace costs. Could I ask you if you've got questions to put them into the chat, and what we'll do is we'll pick them up at the end of the session, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for some Q&A at the beginning. Next slide, please. So first, we'll start with some introductions. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm John O'Brien, the MD and founder of LCMB, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Sam, today. So Sam, maybe you could do a quick intro.
Yes, hi John. Hello everyone. My name's Sam. Sam Brown. I'm a net zero carbon consultant at LCMB. I've been working with clients such as Pinewood Studios, Oxfordshire County Council, Cherwell District Council, and Bouygues, who are a large company who manage a lot of hospitals, and helping them to reduce their carbon and their costs.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. Next slide, please. So at LCMB, our mission is to make a difference for our clients by helping them make their workplaces, buildings and estates more efficient, economical and environmentally sustainable. And we do this by improving performance, reducing operating costs and reducing energy use and carbon emissions. Next slide, please. So every workplace has the potential to be more efficient and ultimately cost less to run. And at LCMB, we support our clients to develop the net zero carbon plans, the operating optimization plans, and the workplace performance plans to help improve what happens in your workplaces, reduce the resource use and operating costs. Next slide, please. So we can help you save energy through our net zero carbon plans and energy management, save costs through our facilities management and workplace performance area, and then support you to implement the invest to save ideas and options to improve your economy and environmental sustainability. Next slide, please. At the beginning, Sam mentioned some of the customers we're working with. So we work with a diverse cross-section of public and private sector clients, and these include organizations such as Pinewood and Universal Studios, who we're helping reduce the energy use, operating costs, and net zero carbon. We're currently working with Mapletree, helping them create an investment strategy to minimize the cost to get their estate to EPCB by 2030. And we've just completed some work with the University of Oxford, writing their Sustainable Development Guide for the Capital Development Programme. Next slide, please. So let's talk about building a net zero carbon plan. So today I'll cover where do you start, what do you need to do, what costs and resources are required, and finally, why should you do it? What are the benefits of setting out on the journey to create and implement a net zero carbon plan and strategy for your organization? Next slide, please. So start by understanding your carbon emissions. So carbon emissions are typically broken down into three areas, what's called Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So Scope 1 covers the direct energy and emissions from your organization, and will cover gas, oil, LPG consumed in heating and running your buildings. It'll cover refrigerant gas leaks from your organization. It'll cover the emissions from your fleet and any emissions from process undertaken within your organization. For example, the use of anesthetic gases in the NHS, or manufacturing processes within an industrial business. So that's Scope 1, the direct. Scope 2 is the indirect energy use in your organization and buildings, and covers the electrical energy that you import from the grid. And then Scope 3 covers all other areas associated with your supply chain and operation of your organization, buildings and infrastructure. Next slide, please. So typically, the Scope 3 areas break down into 15 areas which are defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and covers areas such as water use, waste use, business travel, employee commuting, the use of products within your organization, the production of products, franchising, investment. So it covers all of the other activity within your organization. Next slide, please. So where do you start? So you should start, and we would recommend, by creating a baseline. So taking a calendar year or a financial year and setting out to work or define what your carbon emission or your carbon footprints were in that period. So with Scope 1 and 2, these areas are relatively straightforward to collate the data. There'll be billing information from whoever supplies you with your electricity, with your oil, with your LPG, with your gas. You'll have F-gas logs, which will define the amount of refrigerant leakage over the year, and you'll have information around the other processes that you undertake, as well as mileage details for any fleet that you own. So Scope 1 and 2 are relatively straightforward in terms of collating that information and then applying the conversion factors to work out the CO2 emissions from your organization. Scope 3 is a bit more of a challenging area for most organizations because typically the data sets aren't well structured or collected in a way that makes it easy to work out the volumes of what you're doing in the Scope 3 area. So our recommendation would be to look at the data sets that you've got, create a first pass estimate of your Scope 3 emissions, and then identify what you can do as an organization going forward to improve the quality of your data set and your Scope 3 emission volume, and then over subsequent periods you can refine and become more accurate in terms of your Scope 3 definition. Next slide, please. So for most organizations, Scope 1 and 2 emissions will be approximately 25% of your carbon footprint. Scope 3 will be 75%. So Scope 3 is typically 3 times Scope 1 and 2. So once you've identified your carbon emissions or estimated your Scope 3 in addition to your Scope 1 and 2, you can identify which areas are the largest source of carbon emissions. Once you've done that, you can think about what you can do as an organization to mitigate or reduce those emissions. So examples would be ensuring equipment is switched off when not required, that you reduce the volume of waste produced by your organization and perhaps produced by the use of inbound goods. So all of these areas will help you to low cost or zero cost of reduction in your carbon emissions. Once you've exhausted the opportunity for your organization to look at what you can do operationally to mitigate your carbon emissions, you can then look at investor-safe solutions. So an investor-safe solution is a project which allows you to invest capital or time in reducing your carbon emissions. A good example for Scopes 1 and 2 would be the use of LED lighting to replace less efficient lighting. So you would have a capital cost in replacing the equipment, and then over time, the energy saved from the more efficient lighting would pay back the cost of capital. Another example might be a program to mitigate waste within your organization, where you would have a cost to implement the program, but the savings would accrue from the savings in managing the disposal of those waste streams. Once you've defined those investor-safe solutions, you can implement the projects in your organization and work to engage your stakeholders, your employees, your supply chain in implementing those measures. And then we always recommend having a measurement and verification process around the projects to ensure that you're delivering the savings that you've set out to, tweak where required, and capture the lessons learned from those implementation. Next slide, please. So clearly there are costs and resources required to actually implement a net zero carbon program. So the initial costs will be the setup costs, which will include the costs for creating a baseline and a plan. And then you have implementation costs for projects. Typically, the projects that we would recommend or see in organizations for scope 1, 2, and 3 would have paybacks of 6 months to 5 years. We'd always recommend focusing on carbon reduction projects which have a financial payback which is commensurate or in line with the investment criteria for your organization. And then once you've exhausted those projects, you've got to the end of the economically viable invest to save carbon reduction for your organization, and you can then consider whether you want to make subsequent investment or look at potentially carbon offsetting if you're looking to achieve a net zero carbon performance. Monitoring costs for the project should be included within the projects themselves. And again, we would recommend a time horizon of 3 years is sensible for most organizations and businesses with respect to the net zero carbon plan. So you'd be looking to refresh the plan within 3 years to account for any changes to technology legislation or any changes to your operating environment and organization. So clearly, internal or external resources are required to help you develop your net zero carbon plan and implement it. And this can be internal resources who have an understanding of this space, supplemented by external consultants such as ourselves. Next slide, please. So why should you do it? Why should you invest in creating a net zero carbon plan and setting out to become more environmentally sustainable? Well, there are cost savings and position and risk benefits for an organization in setting out on a sustainable journey. So clearly there are invest to save returns for scope 1, 2, and 3 projects. These are projects that make economic sense based on the return and allow you to reduce the resource and energy used in your organization and your carbon emissions. Becoming more sustainable and having a net zero carbon plan is becoming more of a prerequisite for business to business businesses and business to consumers. And by way of example, if you transact with public sector organizations such as the NHS or local government to pre-qualify as a supplier, these days you need to be able to demonstrate that you have a net zero carbon plan, a sustainability plan, and are working towards the legally binding commitments in the UK to be net zero carbon by 2050. Also, we're seeing both high street financiers and other lenders offer preferential debt financing and other financing packages to businesses for businesses that can demonstrate they are green. Most financial organizations are under pressure from an ESG perspective to be able to demonstrate they're working with greener businesses. It also allows you to de-risk your business and assets against carbon stranding. And an example of that is the work that we're doing with Mapletree Green Park, where we're ensuring that when they get to 2030, that the commercial buildings are at an EPC rating of B. And if they're not able to achieve that, they're no longer able to lease and let out those assets. Our experience is being that starting later with the net zero carbon journey tends to be more expensive and disruptive for organizations. And the other thing about looking at a net zero carbon plan is it allows you to think about how you protect your organization and people against the impact of climate change in the longer term. How your estate, your buildings, your workplaces, your infrastructure will adapt and be able to deal with the impact of climate change over the coming years and decades. So organizations such as the NHS are modeling their estate at the moment to look at how they deal with overheating in the future and protect the well-being of their people and patients. And the other thing that we would expect to see, particularly with a change in government, which looks likely, is that legislation and regulation in the green space is likely to get tighter. And having done the thinking around the net zero carbon plan, it will prepare you to be able to respond to and mitigate the impact of those changes. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples of customer success stories from the work that we've delivered over the recent past. And the first here is King's College London, who has been a client of LCMB for 15 years. They're a very large organisation with over $1 billion turnover now and 30,000 students. And with King's College London, we looked at two of their biggest buildings. This is a new Franklin Wilkins building in Waterloo in London, and the other building is the new Hunt House building at the Guy's campus. Two very large buildings with large, complex research and teaching facilities. And what we looked to do was to recycle some of the life cycle funds in these PFI projects. So £2 million of life cycle funding was invested in a basket of energy conservation measures, and was designed to pay back that capital within 5 years. And in fact, the project delivered the payback in just a little over 4 years, saving 14% energy cost per annum, 1,500 tons of CO2, a 13% carbon reduction across buildings. And the basket of interventions in that instance included LED lighting, BMS applications, or optimization, I should say, and equipment changes. Next slide, please. So equally, we've done a similar piece of work with Karsha in Banbury via an ESOS project, Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme. So we identified a range of energy saving projects, delivering 275 tons of CO2 saving with an average payback of 3.5 years. Next slide, please. And another example was Howard Tennants, who are an organisation that operate over 3 million square feet of warehousing across the UK. And typically in a warehouse, lighting is one of the, if not the single source, largest source of consumption of energy. And with Howard Tennants, we looked at modifying the lighting control functionality within their warehouses to improve its operation. And the approach delivered energy savings of 14% with no impact to their operation and a payback in less than 12 months, less than a year. The next slide, please. So in summary, delivering or creating a net zero carbon plan which works for your organization and delivers savings should start by understanding your carbon emissions. And then once you've done that, you can create a baseline to identify the opportunities, identifying the area where you've got the largest carbon emissions, and then create invest to save opportunities, projects which pay back in line with the financial criteria or the hurdle rate for your organization. It will require resources, internal, perhaps externally, if you haven't got the expertise to create and implement the plan. And as I explained, there are benefits, real benefits, tangible benefits available to actually creating and implementing a net zero carbon plan and a more sustainable approach for your organization. And they include cost savings, positioning with your customers, be they consumers or other businesses, the opportunity to de-risk your organization, and the opportunity to access finance. The next slide, please. So I'm just going to move to questions and answers. So if you do have a question, please drop it into the chat. I'm going to ask my colleagues to raise the questions with me because I'm not able to see the chat on the phone that I'm calling in on. But I'm going to start with a question to Sam. So Sam, you've been working recently with several of our customers to quantify Scope 3 emissions. It's typically one of the more challenging areas for organizations to deal with. So what tips and lessons learned would you share with our audience today based on the experience you've had recently?
Thanks, John. I would say that probably the biggest tip I would say is not to be daunted by it, because it is a much more complex area than Scope 1 and 2. I think it can seem like quite there's so much data required and quite a lot of information, a lot of stakeholders to speak to, both internal and also customers and suppliers. I think the best thing to do is to just make a start, to start on that road, start looking at your data, what data is available. The greenhouse gas protocol very much makes it clear that you don't have to have all the information available to you to start footprinting your scope 3 emissions. And so make a start, and gradually it can be a very phased process. It can be a gradual process over time. As you're learning more about your organisation, talking to more of your stakeholders, you can be incrementally improving your carbon footprint and also the ways that you're implementing to reduce your scope 3 emissions.
Okay, thank you, Sam. And so which areas are likely to have the largest carbon emissions in the scope 3 areas? I think earlier in the presentation I presented sort of 15 areas that are typically referenced in the greenhouse gas protocol, but from the work that you've done, which areas jump out as having the largest emissions?
Well, it very much depends on the organisation and depends on the business. For businesses that manufacture, that are, making widgets, the largest areas of scope 3 emissions can be both the raw materials that you're using, the emissions associated with them, the transportation of your raw materials, but also the end use of products. So, how long do your customers use your product for? What are the emissions associated with that, and how are those products disposed? For organisations like universities or for councils, the scope 3 emissions, the biggest areas usually are areas like procurement and construction projects, large capital costs. And also areas such as investments can be a large area of scope 3 emissions. If an organisation has a lot of money invested in heavily carbon intensive industries, that can be a large area on the balance sheet.
Okay. Got a couple of other questions here. So typically, what are the largest challenges in creating a net zero carbon plan? So let me start with an answer, and then I'll come back to you, Sam, to see if you've got something to add to it. So I think we covered a couple of them in the presentation. So scope 1 and 2 normally are fairly straightforward, should be straightforward. Sometimes it can be challenging to get correct information from energy suppliers, but that's normally a minor problem. So generating the scope 1 and 2 emissions is generally straightforward. The scope 3, as we sort of indicated, is the more challenging area because the data tends to be not in a structured way, and most organisations are more complex to sort of capture and quantify the emissions. It's an area that most organisations are just starting on. So those are some challenges. The other challenges tend to be around the internal work in an organisation where you need to set a date. So setting a date that is practicable and you can actually deliver can be a challenge, and it requires some thought in terms of the level of investment that will be required. And equally, once you've exhausted what you can economically and practically do to reduce your carbon emissions, what are you going to do in terms of offsetting? And offsetting is an area that is yet to be properly defined and regulated. So I think the biggest challenges are really quantifying the scope 3 area, thinking about the date that you set, and then mobilizing and implementing the resources required to actually achieve and realize your plan. I mean, Sam, is there anything you'd add to that? Is there any other area that perhaps I've missed?
I think one of the challenges that businesses are facing at the moment is that there's a very limited information on how the kind of legal and regulatory landscape is going to change over the next few years. And so I think hopefully that, there will be more clarity after the election. But I think that's a real challenge for businesses, is knowing, what are the rules going to be in a year's time. And so that's something that that businesses are facing currently.
Sorry, Sam, you go on.
Also, I just wanted to say we've actually had a question here that I'll read out to you.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Pratish. So the question is, how often should businesses review and update their net zero carbon plan?
So I think my view would be that a 3-year horizon is a sensible horizon for most organisations. So if you create a plan, I'd be putting a 3-year horizon on it, because I think that's long enough to be able to make meaningful impact to an organisation, and short enough to be able to review it and update it for the changes within both your marketplace, what you're doing as an organisation, and legislation. So typically, most organisations we've worked with have worked to a 3-year plan. Sometimes it can be longer depending on the organisation, and sometimes shorter. But for me, I think 3 years seems like a sensible period. Sam, do you have a similar or different view on that point?
No, I think you're probably right there. I think it's such a fast evolving area. I think technology is moving on all the time. Methodologies for quantifying emissions and for reducing emissions are changing all the time. I think 3 years is a sensible period. I think we're probably going to get to a point where businesses will actually report on their carbon footprint in the way that they currently report on their financial, their annual financial summary. They will also report on their annual carbon summary, and so perhaps it will be an annual thing in the future. But I think currently 3 years would be a sensible approach.
Okay, thank you, Sam. And the last question, which I'll cover before we sort of wrap up, is there a business case and return on investment on the cost of creating net zero carbon plans? And hopefully what I've sort of highlighted earlier in the presentation is, yes, we believe there's a business case. So typically the invest to save projects that you can implement for scope 1, 2, and 3 will have a financial return and will pay for themselves. Most organizations are under pressure to demonstrate to their consumers, be they other businesses or individuals, that they're making progress and becoming more sustainable. Not doing that in the future is likely to preclude you from being able to access business opportunities. It de-risks your organization's future and potentially gives you access to preferential finance. So can I have the next slide, please? So I'm just going to wrap up. And before I wrap up, I'm going to say, if anybody has a further question or needs some help, just reach out to us. Our contact details are up on the screen there, and we're on the screen earlier. And there is a wide range of tips, guidance, and applications that you can download from our website, which will help. So please do go on there and download the support that's available. And as I say, if you do have a problem or you want some help and support, reach out to Sam or myself or any member of the team. We'd be delighted to have an exploratory conversation with you and try and point you in the right direction. So I'm just going to wrap up and say thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great day. Enjoy this great sunshine. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.